And finally, whether archipelagic studies.
Archipelagic studies. Archipelagic, John Kerrigan talked about archipelagic Macbeth as the new term for Macbeth, and he joked about whether it would catch on. And I think archipelagic is not a word that's popular in the street, but then neither particularly is British Imperial Monarchy or British Empire, although they're real things that people are living with and dealing with in their ignorance. So I think archipelagic English, that brave title for that big book, I mean, to write a book of 250,000 words of that importance and give it a title, I actually think that when I read the typescript of archipelagic English, I suggested to John Kerrigan that he use a different title, because precisely for that reason, archipelagic is a kind of geographical term, which, so it might say in that sense, might seem politically correct or non-controversial, but rather than say British, which is controversial and contentious. But I think archipelagic, now the irony is archipelagic studies is coming into a lot of different areas, including geography, and there's journals of archipelagic studies, there's a book on archipelagic modernism. So I think in a way it's not set the heather alight, but it's singed a little bit of purple heather, perhaps somewhere, some patch and some mountainside. So I think archipelagic studies should be a step forward from the new British history, because it doesn't use the word British and it recognises that North Atlantic archipelago, it recognises these islands, if you want to use that complicated expression. It's an attempt to bring some kind of geographical neutrality to talking about the British state and empire and its relations with its kind of cognate and neighbouring Celtic nations. So I think there's still life in archipelagic studies. I think archipelagic studies, as it happens, is probably taking more of a grip in other areas. Now people talk about archipelagic poetry and so on. In early modern studies, it's slightly awkward because I don't think a work like John Kerrigan's has really been taken on board yet, but I think very slowly, and it's happening now in a kind of wave of essays after that big book, I'm sure that it will become increasingly important, and I'm still attached to it despite having issues with the title. Of course there is an irony, and that is archipelagic English there being, if you like, English literature. And I think that what English literature is not neutral. It's not neutral either. So you can say British is a problem, let's say archipelagic, but if you're still saying English rather than say archipelagic studies or archipelagic cultures or archipelagic, politics or history, that's different. But as I said at the beginning in relation to words like criticism, crisis and political criticism, the language is complicated, and I think people disagree on words, even if they end up using the same words, because in some ways, when Derrida said text and Foucault ridiculed him for being reductive, Derrida's notion of text wasn't so different from Foucault's notion of discourse, but they used different words. By discourse, Foucault meant something that was political, that was engaged, that was problematic and so on. And I think Derrida meant the same thing by text, although Foucault talked about textualisation as a kind of trivialisation of politics, and although people like Terry Eagleton, Edward Said followed Foucault down the line of discourse as politics and Foucault's the more political, I think that lost touch with the fact that Derrida wasn't so far away from Foucault in terms of levels of engagement with language and history and politics.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add that you haven't said in answer to these questions?
I'll probably say this is a new form, because in some ways talking in like this is almost like it's some elements of a monologue and of talking to yourself, even when there are questions or when the questions are taken away. That's how interviews operate. The first time I did an interview, I was surprised when I realised the questions were removed, and it made it look as if I was speaking to an agenda that wasn't my agenda. I didn't know this was how things happened. This was actually a BBC documentary, but they asked me questions that were their questions, but it seemed as though I had particular passions and interests. As I say, I'm a sceptic when it comes to crisis, because I think the crisis has been around a long time. and people have been dealing with it and suffering it. And I also think criticism, it usually is the kind of criticism that one does, that we do, that we value, and we don't value other kinds of criticism. Whereas, take something like New Historicism. When I started to read historical criticism from 100 years ago, started to read through the archive, if you like, I became much more tolerant and much more broad-minded about what counted as good historical criticism. So I think that it's about modishness and about being caught up in the contemporary moment, caught up in our own values and work and so on. We tend to disrespect or to disregard earlier forms of work. And I'm really enjoying hanging around the 17th century just now, loitering with intent. And I think you learn a lot about the debates that were in play then, the impact on today. So the crisis has been with us for a long time, and so has the criticism.